Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrae Crouch. I'm the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute. And on behalf of the staff and the visiting fellows of JWJI, I'd like to welcome you to today's Race and Difference Colloquium session. I'd like to start our program by acknowledging the Muskogee Creek people who lived, worked, produced knowledge on, and nurtured the land where Emory's Oxford and Atlanta campuses are now located. In 1821, 15 years before Emory's founding, the Muskogee were forced to relinquish this land. We recognize the sustained oppression, land dispossession, and involuntary removals of the Muskogee and Cherokee peoples from Georgia and the Southeast. Emory and JWJI seek to honor the Muskogee Nation and other indigenous caretakers of this land by humbly seeking knowledge of their histories and committing to the respectful stewardship of the land. Before we begin today's session, I want to just make you aware of a program that's coming up this week. This week, we're going to have another one of our public dialogues in race and difference sessions. The theme of this panel is going to be Black Asian solidarity. And we have a great lineup of speakers who we're going to engage in a robust discussion of this. So we hope that you sign up for it. It'll be on Zoom. And so we hope that you can join us on Thursday. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Claudrena Harold to give a talk that I've actually been excited about for a really long time when I first saw her present on part of this topic at ASALH, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Dr. Claudrena Harold is professor and chair of the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia. She's the author of 3 books. First, The Rise and Fall of the Garvey Movement in the Urban South, 1918 to 1942. And New Negro Politics in the Gem South. Today, she's going to be talking about her most recent book called When Sunday Comes, Gospel Music in the Soul and Hip Hop Eras. She's also co-edited 2 volumes called The Punitive Turn, New Approaches to Race and Incarceration, and Charlottesville 2017, The Legacy of Race and Inequity. In addition to her traditional academic scholarship, she also does really engaging work on the history of Black student activism at the University of Virginia. With her partner, Kevin Everson, she has co-directed 9 short films about UVA's Black history. And these films have been shown at a wide variety of venues, including the Berlin International Film Festival, the New York Film Festival, the Black Star Film Festival, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the National Gallery of Art, the International Film Festival of Rotterdam, the Oberhausen International Short Film Festival, the London Film Festival, the Vienna Shorts Film Festival, the Melbourne International Film Festival, Cinema du Reel, the Vienna International Film Festival, TIFF Lightbox, the Chicago International Film Festival, and the Hamburg International Short Film Festival. So today she's going to be talking about her most recent book on gospel music in the hip hop and soul eras. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Claudrena Harold.
Thanks so much. It is truly an honor and a privilege to participate in this colloquium. As a native of Jacksonville, Florida, I have long admired and leaned on James Weldon Johnson, a man whose writings informed so much of my scholarship, from our work on Black Southern politics and the Negro era to this gospel book, When Sunday Comes. The chapters on Al Green, Shirley Caesar, and John P. Key bear the influence of his collection, God's Trombones. So thank you so much for this opportunity to share in many ways this work, but also James Weldon Johnson's profound influence. On the morning of June the 28th, 1990, South African freedom fighters Nelson and Mandela traveled to Detroit, Michigan, as part of their 10-day tour of the United States. Shortly after their arrival, the Mandelas met workers at the Ford Rouge plant in nearby Dearborn. Sisters and brothers, friends and comrades, the man who is speaking is not a stranger, Nelson Mandela told the crowd of 300 auto workers. The man who is speaking is a member of the UAW. I am your flesh and blood. Later that day, a jubilant crowd of 50,000 assembled in Tiger Stadium to celebrate the anti-apartheid revolutionary whose protracted struggle for a free South Africa had inspired millions. As he had done throughout his tour, Nelson Mandela expressed gratitude to those who had participated in the global struggle against racial injustice. In the face of your own problems and difficulties, you have not forgotten us. Looking optimistically toward the future, Mandela promised, freedom is coming to us. Victory is in sight. Though Mandela was the night's star attraction, the event featured other luminaries, including several musicians closely identified with Motor City: Aretha Franklin, Stevie Wonder, and the gospel quartet, the Weiners. Though several songs in Franklin's catalog of hits perfectly suited the festive occasion, the undisputed Queen of Soul turned to William Brewster's gospel classic, Surely God is Able. A moving affirmation of God's benevolence and ultimate sovereignty, the song was popularized by Clara Ward and the Ward Singers in the late 1940s. In her abridged rendition, Aretha Franklin mesmerizes the crowd with vivid images of God as liberator, comforter, and waymaker.
Mr. Mandela, yeah, he's got a long oh, it's young. But before you leave, shores of America, I want to leave something with him. And a life forever, take it all the way back. Surely, he's able, carry.
Twice during her performance, Franklin assures Mandela of God's readiness to intervene in the days ahead. Aretha Franklin was not the only performer who situated her celebration of Mandela's release within a religious context. Fittingly, the Winans performed their 1985 crossover hit, Let My People Go, a searing critique of South African apartheid. With Marvin Winans on lead vocals, Let My People Go transmuted the principles of divine liberation and the equality of all persons before God into a funk-drenched mosaic of R&B sounds and Jeremiah-inspired lyrics. Though stylistically distinct, the performances of the Winans and Aretha Franklin underscored the centrality of gospel to the Black political imagination. In the many ways the art form has and continues to provide African Americans with a vehicle for self-affirmation, religious expression, cultural meaning-making, community building, and social critique. In his pioneering study, Somebody's Calling My Name, Dr. Wyatt Tee Walker asserts that what Black people are singing religiously will provide a clue as to what is happening to them sociologically. If Walker's assertion holds true, then how does a focus on gospel music expand our understanding of the religious, political, and imaginative worlds of Black people in the post-civil rights era? How does the institution building endeavors, sonic interventions, and theological provocations of gospel singers reflect larger political realities in Black America, the nation, and the world. What might we learn from an engagement with the gospel blues of James Cleveland, the praise and worship melodies of Andrae Crouch, the Holy Ghost anthems of Kirk Franklin, and the weary hip hop blues of a Lecrae? With these questions in mind, I would like to discuss some of the major sonic and political interventions taking place in gospel music during the last 3 decades of the 20th century. Through an engagement with some of the genre's major innovators, I would like to discuss gospel as not just a cutting-edge art form at the center of many major advancements in post-civil rights era Black popular culture, but also as an important discursive space for complex conversations around politics, race, interracial fellowship, class conflict, and even sexuality. The gospel field was also a site for complex discussions on aesthetics and culture, and the impact of racial integration on the integrity and sustainability of certain artistic formations. In fact, though gospel is rarely included in conversations about the Black arts movement, many writers view the genre as an integral component of the Black aesthetic. Indeed, Pearl Williams Jones went so far as to argue that gospel had, quote, distilled the aesthetic essence of the Black arts into a unified whole. Thus, the art form had to be preserved and advanced at all costs. Taking the lead in many of these conversations about the aesthetics of gospel and the centrality of preserving its essence while working to ensure its growth as an art form was the Reverend James Cleveland. For more than 20 years, Cleveland was the dominant figure in Black gospel music as both an artist and an institution builder. Working in what Albert Murray refers to as the blues idiom, Cleveland confronted, acknowledged, and contended with, quote, the infernal absurdities and impending frustrations in the nature of all existence. And yet on songs like Where Is Your Faith? Lord, Do It For Me, God Is, and Peace Be Still, there breathed a hope in the music that struck a resonant chord in the hearts of many fans.
For this God we serve is so good. Is there anybody here that knows that God? Is there anybody here that knows that God? He didn't have to wake me up. No, no. He didn't have to. My God. No. There ought to be one witness here that knows that God is so good. There ought to be.
James Cleveland's accomplishments commanded the respect of fellow artists within and beyond the religious world. On her promotion tour for the Black Book, writer Toni Morrison declared, "I want to do for Black publishing what James Cleveland does for the Gospels." Not content with praise and individual accolades and chart dominance, Cleveland would create the Gospel Music Workshop of America in 1967. In many ways, the Gospel Music Workshop of America's vision squared perfectly with the self-determinist ethos of the Black Power era. Cleveland and his associates' expansive vision conceived of the GMWA's institution building endeavors as a multi-layered process that would eventually involve 3 major initiatives. The first initiative, the convening of annual conventions where gospel artists shared new ideas and techniques, discussed major trends and developments in the marketing and production of gospel music, strategized over how to increase Black control over the business of gospel, discussed the role of politics and activism in Black sacred music and build networks of fellowship that transcended local communities. The second major initiative was the release of GMWA recordings that provided a larger platform for budding musicians and songwriters. And the third major initiative was the formation of a gospel music college dedicated to teaching the history, politics, aesthetics, and business of gospel music. Toward this goal, James Cleveland would form a partnership with civil rights activist Floyd McKissick and Soul City, the all-Black town in North Carolina. So throughout the mid-1970s, the GMWA negotiated with Soul City officials about the possibility of purchasing 25 acres of land where they would establish a gospel college. GMWA leaders would argue that this college would not only push forward Black Power's cultural agenda, but would also assist Soul City in its larger developmental work. Unfortunately, Soul City collapsed under the weight of strong opposition from North Carolina Republicans like Senator Jesse Helms, and also it would collapse under the weight of fiscal problems. Disappointed but not devastated, Cleveland remained committed to the idea of a Black college. Moreover, he continued in his efforts to preserve the gospel music heritage through his music and through the Gospel Music Workshop's annual conventions. As noted earlier, Cleveland's conversations on the importance of preserving the gospel heritage through institution building was part of a larger discourse involving other Black intellectuals and artists. If Black churches lose their unique and distinctive musical idiom, Wyatt Tee Walker wrote in the last chapter of Somebody's Calling My Name, then those same churches will be culturally and religiously out of context. Strident measures must be taken to preserve the integrity of the cultural vehicle. Black sacred music in this instance, so that the sense of history so crucial to an oppressed people is not destroyed. Cleveland and Walker's commitment was rooted not just in the idea of Black sacred music as a critical reservoir of Black culture, but also as, quote, a vital instrument for a ministry of social change. Here was his perspective. Walker's was a perspective born from his engagement with the multi-layered meaning of the spirituals and what he viewed as the importance of music and the victories of the civil rights movement. However, one suspects his perspective was also informed by the contemporary gospel music scene. Though rarely included in scholarly and popular conversations about the politics of Black culture in the 1970s, gospel music was far from a politically free zone. And perhaps no two artists demonstrate this more than Shirley Caesar and Andrae Crouch. Coming to national prominence as a member of the famous caravans from the late 1950s to the mid-1960s, then striking out on her own to become one of gospel music's biggest stars, Shirley Caesar elevated the art form to new heights during the 1970s and 1980s. As a recording artist equally adept with traditional and contemporary styles, Caesar sampled liberally from various musical idioms and genres. Over the arc of her illustrious career, she recorded traditional hymns, sermonettes, soulful tunes, and country ballads. Equally impressive was her political audacity, which found expression in her discussions of racism, classism, poverty, and AIDS. A master storyteller, Caesar folded her social critique in metaphor and humor. She was never didactic, neither was she predictable. On songs like The Battlefield, she uses the story of a preacher whose son was murdered in Vietnam to explore the meaning of suffering and the crisis of faith within even the most religiously devout communities. The human costs of war are present in this song, but not explicitly critiqued. She takes a completely different approach on Comfort Me, on which she denounces the war in Southeast Asia as unjust and the cause of unimaginable suffering. Turning inward, Caesar always paid attention to the intra-class politics within the Black community. Even as Caesar incorporated new sounds and styles into her music, her social critique remained razor sharp. Take as a case in point. One of her most celebrated recordings of the 1980s, live in Chicago. The record, which featured the award-winning Thompson Community Singers on background vocals, dominated the gospel charts for nearly 8 months. No small factor in the record's success was its hit single, Hold My Mule, a brilliant sermonette centered on a 86-year-old farmer named Shouting John who had joined a dead church. Tensions arise when Shouting John refuses to restrain himself during worship service, despite repeated efforts on the part of the church leadership to put an end to his excessive carrying on. Feeling as John's excessive carrying on had crossed a dangerous line, the ministers decide to pay the elder a visit at his home and threaten him with disfellowship. I want to provide you with just a brief clip of this song.
I just want to take time to tell you a story about a man called Shouting John. John joined a dead church. They didn't believe in shouting. They didn't believe in dancing and speaking in tongues. But when they opened the doors of the church, John joined that church. And when John joined that church, he came in dancing. Because John was dancing all around the church. The deacons ran, sat him down, he jumped back up. They tried to hold his legs, his hands were going. When they tried to hang him loose, the feet were going. They did everything they could to stop John from shouting. And when they couldn't finally stop him, they made up in their mind, we got to go up to John's house, y'all. Or something is wrong with him. Doesn't he know? We don't act like that in our church. Doesn't John know? We got to be terrorists in our church. We go away. We go away. We go into John's house. Well, when they got out there, they found this old piece of man. Him and an old beat up mule plowing in the field. They drove up all the deacons. They got out of their fine cars. They walked over to John. John looked around and said, hold you. Walked over to him and said, brother, I know you come out here. You come out here to tell me that I praise the Lord too much. You come out here to tell me that I praise too much. One of the deacons told him that if you don't stop shouting, if you don't stop dancing, we will put you out of our church. Somebody say yeah. Say yeah. Say yeah.
Pointing to his massive estate, Shouting John asked the delegation, did you see all that land you just drove upon? God gave me all that land, and not one time have I been to the courthouse, not one time have I been to the cemetery, but you don't want me to dance in your church. And unrepentant John then declares, well, put me out. I can't hold my peace. To add insult to injury, Shouting John proceeds to shout and dance all over the property. I think there are always two questions that I have when I hear this song. Why did Shouting John don't join that dead church? And what did that delegation think they would do when they got to his house? Throughout her career, whether on songs like Shouting John, Choose Ye This Day, Battlefield, The Praying Slave Lady, Be Careful of the Stones You Throw, Shirley Caesar confronted the nation's long history of classism, racism, the human cost of war, and state-sanctioned violence. So much of her music tackled the subject of tensions within the Black church. While Caesar and other faith leaders were concerned about these class tensions, these denominational tensions, others focused their attention on interracial, intercultural, and denominational tensions within the body of Christ. And leading the way in this instance was Andrae Crouch, an innovator who viewed gospel music as much more than sound, as much more than the musical variant of the gospel. For Andrae Crouch, gospel music, contemporary Christian music, was a laboratory to test out the possibilities and limitations of interracial and spiritual unity. Across the span of nearly 5 decades, Andrae Crouch stirred the passions of whites and Blacks alike with an array of hits. Through it all, Take a Little Time, My Tribute, The Blood Will Never Lose Its Power, Jesus is the Answer, and Soon and Very Soon, among others. Not just a proven hit maker, Crouch was an album artist, committed to producing high-quality records that elevated gospel music as an art form. The sequence of albums Crouch and the Disciples released between 1968 and 1978 was nothing short of spectacular. Played regularly on white and Black radio stations, Crouch's music appealed to different and sometimes conflicting demographics in the body of Christ. At the height of his popularity, he opened new possibilities for the construction of what theologian Howard Thurman refers to as a common environment for the purpose of providing normal experiences of worship among Christians from diverse socioeconomic and racial backgrounds. Crouch's influence and sound also penetrated the world of secular music, where his circle of collaborators included Quincy Jones, the Commodores, Michael Jackson, Madonna, Joe Sample, and the list goes on and on. On repeated occasions, Crouch clashed with gospel purists who felt his crossover music or his sound was outside the boundaries of what gospel should and should not be, or should be, excuse me. A little background on Andrae Crouch. Andrae Crouch, a musical prodigy, was born in San Francisco, California, to Catherine and Benjamin Crouch in 1942. Though the Golden City was Crouch's birthplace, he was reared in Los Angeles. Showing musical promise at an early age, Crouch wrote The Blood Will Never Lose Its Power when he was only 14. That song appeared on his 1968 debut record, Take the Message Everywhere. Defying easy categorization, Take the Message Everywhere cut across a variety of musical genres, from country to Motown pop to Southern gospel. One hears the influence of his Kojic roots, as well as the influence of the California sound of the Beach Boys, the Fifth Dimension, and even the Mamas and Papas. Over the next 5 years, Crouch helps build a lyrical and sonic foundation for 2 genres: contemporary Christian music and urban contemporary gospel. He wrapped his message of God's salvation and Jesus' love in the rhythms of jazz, country, funk, and even disco. Crouch's adventurous approach to music stemmed from not just his creative impulses, but also from his perception of the historical Jesus. Jesus was the biggest radical of all, and thousands hated him, Crouch once mused. He was despised and rejected. He came to his own and they received him not. He was a peace radical when there was confusion, a light radical in the midst of darkness, a supply radical when there was death, and he is a hope radical in the midst of hopelessness. With this in mind, Crouch welcomed music that defied the status quo. Maybe we need a loud guitar to stir the people up to listen and think about what they are hearing. Maybe we need a little radicalism to make people turn around and try to evaluate what they hear, not just hear something and walk away. Through his judicious fusion of various genres, Crouch created a musical form capable of hosting diverse communities. And perhaps few albums help us understand this more than his two live recordings, live at Carnegie Hall and live in London. One of the most celebrated releases in gospel music history, Live at Carnegie Hall, appeared in record stores in 1973. The recording was taken from a Crouch show that was on April the 10th, 1972. To accommodate the thousands of fans who arrived at Carnegie Hall with and without tickets, Crouch would also perform at nearby Calvary Baptist Church before taking the stage at Carnegie. Crouch and the Disciples opened with riveting performances of I Don't Know Why and You Don't Know What You're Missing. At the show's midpoint, Crouch led the crowd in the devotional Hallelujah. Then he segued into one of his more popular songs, Jesus is the Answer. Spirits were high as Crouch and the talented disciples showcased not just their remarkable range, but the diversity of sound shaping the American religious experience. On the hard rocking gospel standard, Can't Nobody Do Me Like Jesus, Crouch digs deep into his cogent roots. 5 years after the recording of Live at Carnegie Hall, Crouch released his highly acclaimed Live in London. Once again, Crouch uses music as a vehicle to recreate and reimagine community. Here, his primary vehicle is the praise and worship genre, which music scholar Birgitta Johnson rightly points out, quote, establishes order, encourages intimacy, and musically reinforces a sense of community and the sacred along the thousands of congregants who attend weekly services. I would argue that songs like You Don't Have to Jump No Pews, I Surrender All, Praise God, and Hallelujah reveal Crouch's ecumenical vision and his commitment to facilitating spiritual intimacy among his listeners. In a moment of fracture and division, Crouch sought to forge a musical path toward the creation of a beloved community. And in doing so, he redefined the sonic, spiritual, and even social possibilities of American religious music. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, other gospel artists revolutionized the sound of the genre. Taking the lead on this front were three gospel groups emerging out of Detroit: the Clark Sisters, Commissioned, and the Weiners. Proud natives of Detroit committed to creating a new gospel aesthetic. These groups embraced new technologies and performative practices. Their sound defies easy categorization. So did their politics. Though speaking to the nation, these groups' political sensibilities developed within the crucible of post-industrial Detroit, ground zero for the urban crisis. The Motor City struggled under the weight of urban divestment, a declining tax base, deindustrialization, neoliberal politics, and an expanding carceral state. None of these realities escaped the notice of the Winans, the Clark Sisters, and Commission, who viewed Detroit's problems as both structural and existential in nature. On studio recordings like the Clark Sisters' Sincerely, Commission's Go Tell Somebody, and the Winans' Tomorrow, strong critiques of structural racism existed alongside conservative narratives attributing society's purported decline to the breakdown of the nuclear, quote, heterosexual family. Their music was complicated, messy, unconventional. And perhaps no album demonstrates this more than an album that I want to talk about very briefly. The Winans' 1990 release, Return, one of the best-selling records in gospel music history, a record that would bridge the sonic worlds of gospel, R&B, and New Jack Swing. Nothing about this record is predictable, not even the featured guests, which include Teddy Riley, Aaron Hall, Michael J. Powell, producer for Anita Baker, Stevie Wonder, and Kenny G. Branching out beyond the gospel world, Return spawned 4 singles that crossed over into the R&B market. It's time, a friend when you cry, and don't leave me. On the Teddy Riley produced It's Time and Don't Leave Me, apocalyptic themes of social disorder, divine judgment, and imminent world destruction blend perfectly with the jagged edges of Riley's New Jack Swing. One might even say Riley's pulsating, menacing grooves sharpened rather than diluted the group's message. Even as the Weiners embraced the sounds of New Jack Swing, the brothers never swayed away from providing a theological perspective on the state of the world. Listen closely to Marvin Winans' impassioned vocals on It's Time, for example, and you'll hear a deep thinker wrestling with what Marty Martin calls the paradoxes and puzzlements of theodicy. Such wrestling reflected the social and political context in which Return was produced. The sound and fury of Return bore the weight of 1989, the year of the earthquake, the year the number of reported AIDS cases in the United States reached 100, the year incumbent Coleman Young battled it out with John Conyers Jr. in the Democratic primary of Detroit's mayor's race. Looking at the challenges ahead, the Weiners pulled no punches. The state of the world mandated a radical reordering of society, a return to the best of our traditions, and a reimagining of what a beloved community might look like in the future. On songs like It's Time and Together We Stand, the Weiners invited listeners to participate in a collective rebuilding of a fractured world. Though never shying away from the hardcore realities of the world, the Weiners remained grounded in the hope that still animated the spirit of many Detroiters who refused to let the naysayers have the last word. Even as the national media bemoaned, quote, the tragedy of Detroit, many Motor City residents envisioned the 1990s as a decade for rebirth, as a decade of rebirth for the city. That optimism surfaces throughout the Weiners' Return. I would argue of the many messages to be gleaned from this album, including the album's photos, of the many messages to be gleaned, one rings loud and clear. The suturing and healing of our fractured world demands care for and connection to one another. And that collective care must extend beyond the walls of the church. In the 30 years since the release of Return, much has changed in the world of gospel music. Still a central part of Black cultural life, gospel pervades every aspect of popular culture, including television and film. The genre not only continues to produce exciting voices, but it also drives many of the aesthetic revolutions and interventions in other art forms. On a more personal note, it continues to provide a space for me to make sense of the tragic comic realities of life. Perhaps no time was the power and unspeakable joy of the music more apparent for me than the autumn of 2017. On the morning of August the 21st, to be exact, as I walked through the central grounds of the University of Virginia, haunting images of torch-wielding white supremacists screaming, "You will not replace us," flashed through my mind. Though 2 weeks have passed since the Unite the Right rallies of August 11th and 12th, the sights and sounds of anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, and misogyny lingered in the air. Nervous but determined to show no signs of uneasiness on my first day of class, I turned to my surest source of comfort, gospel music. Over the next 2 hours, a mixture of traditional and contemporary gospel guided me through rugged terrain. One song in particular resonated deeply, "The Mighty Clouds of Joy, Mighty High." 5 minutes of gospel truth submerged in the rhythms of disco funk, Mighty High exudes a radiant hope in the evidence of things not seen. It evokes for me memories of the sights and sounds of Sunday morning church services, family reunions, and impromptu get-togethers in the homes of aunts, uncles, and cousins. Written and produced by my uncle, David Crawford, in 1975, Mighty High had long been a part of my sonic world. Its lyrics and melody are seared in my memory. But in the aftermath of August 11th and 12th, the song's lyrics resonated much deeper. Whatever your problem is, you gotta ride the Mighty High. If only momentarily, the song strengthens my resolve to walk through the valley of doubt and despair. I'll stop now and open it up for a collective conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harold, we really, really appreciate the talk. It was provocative and it certainly carried me through sonic memories as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will be happy to read your question to Dr. Harold. The first question is from Edgar Randolph, who writes, "The Negro slave and the Hebrew slave are not allies, they're brothers and sisters. Through the use of the Hebrew scriptures, Blacks and Jews are brothers and sisters. How is the use of the Hebrew scriptures a linkage and shared heritage among Black and Jewish communities, churches, and congregations?" And then as a follow-up, how did Whoopi Goldberg get this wrong as an ally?
In terms of the Hebrew scriptures and its presence in the Gospels going back far beyond the period that I look at, is definitely there. I think I started with "Let My People Go," a song by the Weiners. And if you listen to that song, there's definitely a reference to the Exodus story. If you're familiar with African American religious history and the political uses of African American religious history, indeed, the Exodus story is so central. Of course, Eddie Glaude talks about that in his very important book. So it's always there. And this story of divine liberation and the ways in which the unfolding of God as a liberator, and as a liberator who intervenes on the behalf of the oppressed, you definitely see that in those stories and in that music. And whether it's the Whiners, and I want to that's a great question, because I think even if we focus on that performance with Nelson Mandela, when you think about "Let My People Go," and throughout that song, if you listen to the studio version, there is this reference to the Israelites, and this reference to the Old Testament. But also, if you go and you listen to Aretha Franklin's version on her 1987 album, she goes through this story of God's redemption and a God of the Old Testament, the God of Daniel, the God of Moses. And so that's very much a part of this tradition, and very much a part of the music. And one of the interesting things about the power of this Exodus story is also how it transcends various sonic iterations. And so you see this in contemporary gospel, you see this in traditional gospel as well.
Thank you. Let me ask a question sort of about your periodization. You kind of stop in the 1980s. And how does gospel sort of fit kind of into the current sonic moment? So, I guess if you start with Kirk Franklin, sort of in the sort of infusion of hip hop and the dialogue between gospel and hip hop today, and we could even carry that forward in the second generation stars. We could look at Kiara Sheard, for instance, Karen Clark's daughter, or other folks. Like, what's the connection? What role does gospel play, one, in an increasingly sort of heterogeneous Black religious kind of experience and community, but then also in current debates of the day, like the emergence of Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black lives and other things?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I tried to keep going. And when I talked about what gospel music meant to me, and I talked about what I was listening to, that same, I think 2 days later, when we had an event to try to bring people together, I had a student who talked about what gospel music meant to her. And she, of course, mentioned people like Kirk Franklin. So one of the reasons I think it's still very much present, I've seen a room shift. Amiri Baraka talks about, if you play, James Brown in a bank, the ways in which the atmosphere shifts. If you've never felt the power of what it's like to play Kirk Franklin, like Revolution or Smile, or the impact that has on students is just very it's visceral. But I would say one of the reasons in terms of chronology, so the book stops in 1994 and is very intentional. I think Kirk Franklin ushers in a new era in gospel music, and what he's able to do as an artist with the family is just monumental. And so I think for me, 1994 is the stopping point. It's when Kirk Franklin's live album really blows up. 1994 is also the last year that, that's the year that BB and CC really technically produced their last album together, Relationships. It's the year Sounds of Blackness comes out with their second album. It's the year that Fred Hammond officially leaves Commission. and also really begins to forge this kind of praise and worship sound, or I should say, develop it and advance it in really important ways. And he will be joined, of course, by CeCe Winans, who in 1995 comes out with Alone in His Presence, which to me is like, she's a Winans, but that is Andrae Crouch's child. There's so much about that album. If you ever want to really get a sense of someone who's been influenced by Crouch and has taken that influence and stylized it and digested it and just put it out, for me, Alone in That Presence, and in many ways, CeCe's entire post-BB and CeCe career is there. I think throughout this period in gospel music, you see people negotiating around questions of politics, around questions of race, around questions of class, around questions of police brutality. I think about the artist who's based in Atlanta but has roots in Houston, Lecrae. He's extremely interesting to me. And some of his work dealing with questions around police brutality, Black Lives Matter, what's the purpose of the church? Some of his writings on racial reconciliation are just very interesting to me. And interesting to me, I think, in similar ways, but also different ways than Andrae Crouch. What fascinates me about Andrae Crouch is the ways in which I think he's trying to do something political actually through a form, through an aesthetic. But with Lecrae, you see this in the writings in Billboard. You see this in him talking about racial negotiation and his critiques of, ideas about all lives matter. And so I think it's, and also his conversations about mental health, because I think that those are extremely, important conversations, and you see the art form continuing to develop, and people redefining also what protests mean. Is protest just social critique? Is it just illuminating a problem? Is it also aligning oneself with people who are moving towards change? So when you think about someone like Shirley Caesar, in 1987, she ran for a seat on city council. For her, an activist religion was not just about singing, but it was also about really engaging in politics. And so, you see that continuing. And you see those links, really, like when you think about Kiara Kiki Shear, you see those links. The child of, and so, it's a fascinating art form. I think I stopped in '94, not just because of those developments in terms of Kirk Franklin and people breaking up and coming back together, but also just the internet. I think anybody who does music as a scholarly project, I think the internet, the digital age, streaming, all of that just changes the landscape of the business as well. I think if I continued into the present moment, I would have had to have a chapter on reality shows. And I wasn't doing that. So it's I'm stopping in '94. So the best thing about this, and I just appreciate the conversations because the conversations make me better, is that I've had to learn more about the current moment, because people, when they read the book, they want to know, well, what do you think about this person, or what do you think about that person? And yeah.
Understood. Thanks. I do want to come back to sort of the nexus. We talk about sort of the nexus of gospel to secular Black forms of music, but then also to praise and worship and sort of what could be considered CCM and more white forms of Christian music. But first, I will ask a question by Davina Dansby. Excellent discussion. Definitely agree that gospel music is a balm for the soul. What are your thoughts regarding modern gospel music and the marriage of secular music to traditional gospel tropes? So, for example, gospel rap artists.
Gospel rap artists who do gospel. I think it's exciting. I think it's interesting. I think it demonstrates in many ways. And I think if I knew maybe the specific artist, but I think this. And if I'm not answering your question, you say you're not answering my question, and I'll try to push me more. I think this kind of fusion between gospel and hip hop. I think it's interesting when you look at what's happening in the Christian world, and I sort of talked about Lecrae, and I don't even know if I like to use that term, Christian world, but also I think when you look at the secular world and you look at people like Chance, and you look at some other people, how I really don't want to talk about Kanye. Like the question could be like, what was gospel doing for Kanye in a particular moment? And I don't want to go down that road, but I think that's an interesting thing to me. It doesn't surprise me that hip hop and gospel are together, because I also think that there's a certain unity in Black musical forms that transcend genres. So to be surprised that Snoop Dogg would put out a gospel album is to not recognize that he was listening to the Clark Sisters in the 70s and the 80s. You know, so it's also to understand the totality of a certain experience and the ways in which a lot of these forms are connected. And I would just say, you know, when you look at a lot of art forms, I mean, when you think about Arthur Jafa and the ways in which basically, you know, he was going around galleries just basically playing Thomas Whitfield's, I mean, he was doing more stuff, but the centrality of gospel in so many of the film projects that he's done. But when you think about the exhibit that he had, where it was just Thomas Whitfield's Nothing But the Blood playing on this big gallery screen, or Al Green's Jesus is Waiting, the Soul Train performance. And I think what he was saying is like, really, this art form is at the cutting edge. And so it really shouldn't surprise us that, yeah, like if I want to make a certain album and I want to communicate a certain spirit, I'm going to Leandra Johnson, or I'm going to Kirk Franklin, or I'm going to Fred Hammond. And let's be honest, is that any different than Michael Jackson and Quincy Jones and Madonna going to Andrae Crouch? If I'm going to make like a prayer, who are you going to go to? Andrae Crouch. If I'm trying to do Quincy Jones' Color Purple and I need to get this done and I need some songs, who am I going to go to? Andrae Crouch. Quincy Jones, if I'm doing the Roots and I'm trying to set a certain spirit, a certain atmosphere, and I'm going to James Cleveland. And so it has always existed. But I think this is also the interesting moment where I think there's the artist community, you know, and I think about people like Kevin Jerome Everson and Colleen Smith and Jatavia Gary, like these amazing experimental filmmakers who they're sampling gospel, they're sampling the Pentecostal tradition. But like, if you think about Colleen Smith, I mean, she's also sampling, you know, Alice Coltrane. So I think about like Alice Coltrane and her work in the 70s and how she, you know, the organ and just how she's rooted in that Detroit religiosity, and at the same time it's now this fertile space for all of these other like artists. And so I think if you don't know the totality of the culture sometimes, and like to understand that you can go I could go turn on 101.5 and hear Juveniles back that thing up, and then Donnie McClurkin's We Fall Down, and nobody faces any contradiction. Then it's like understanding that kind of, you know, that connection. So I think it's all good. I mean, I think to dig deeper into the culture and always try to find this inspiration and ways to, you know, improve the art form. I think that's just like extremely important. I mean, I'm always looking at stuff from the 60s and the 70s. I mean, I talked about James Weldon Johnson. I mean, that book and what he was doing with that book and the artwork, that influenced how I even wanted when Sunday Comes to look. I mean, he shaped my decision with also those expensive prices of Getty's images, but like he shaped my decision on like, I mean, and also Kevin was like, when I was complaining about like money and how much some of these photos cost, it's like, just shoot it yourself. And so like, it's like you're always digging into that wellspring of culture.
Thank you. So Shari Mackinson is asking part of the question that I wanted to ask. So do you have thoughts about what happens to gospel music in the coming generations? For example, we have groups like Maverick Music that take traditional gospel singing and make it multicultural, but part of the aesthetic appeal is the blackness, even though they're marketed to larger white audiences. Is this the commodification of the gospel sound leading to its being erased or to its no longer being Black? And I'll append this question, what about sort of the rise of gospel artists who really do view themselves as being praise and worship leaders? And like, are we going to come to a point where I can't tell the difference between a Tasha Cobbs Leonard and a Chris Tomlin?
Woo, fighting words. I try to stay away from acculturation arguments. And maybe I lack courage, because I think that sometimes we assume that a moment is like praise and worship to me as a genre is very interesting. And these efforts to kind of locate its, and I don't want to say racial origins and manifestations, but it becomes very complicated. How you feel about praise and worship and how you identify, I think, the sound culturally, I think is very based on generation. How I think about Andrae Crouch now was not how I thought about Andrae Crouch when I heard him in the 80s and 90s. When I first heard Jesus is the Answer, I was like, I didn't know that that sound originated from Andrae Crouch. So it's interesting when I listen to people who are like 10 years older than me talk about Andrae Crouch in a certain way and playing Andrae Crouch in church, and like they were in the youth choir and Baptist or Kojic, and he was very much a part of their sonic experience. I think for some people that were born 10 years later, that wasn't the case. And I'm not trying to run away from the question, but what I am trying to say is, I think some things that we think the manifestations are or Black or white, or however we think about it, may have a different origin. And if we don't fully understand that origin, it may have a different trajectory. We are in a moment, we have been in a moment for 20 or 30 years where there is just, a certain kind of cross-fertilization, cross-cultural. Yeah, I think a lot of people were worried about the praise and worship. I love the sound. I love the mass choir sound. I love the Thompson Community Choir. I love the Mississippi Mass Choir. I don't hear that anymore. When I listen to our gospel choir at UVA, the sound is radically different. I played them John P. Key. I was telling Dr. Gillespie this. I played them John P. Key like 3 years ago, and they were like, Professor Harold, this sounds like the spirituals. And I was like, what the hell is, what? And so it's like, it's constantly, it's just constantly evolving and changing. And so, I have the concerns. And I think if we look at like someone like James Cleveland, when he's talking about preserving the heritage, when you listen to someone like Shirley Caesar in the 80s talking about preserving the heritage, when you even think about the explosion of gospel festivals, in the 1980s, it's very much about this concern. It's not just, and even so it's also rooted in this idea that certain forms can carry certain spirits. Albertina Walker often talked about the fact that, this contemporary stuff is cool, but when you get in trouble, what you gonna listen to? And so I think it's, and I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I think it's there. I think it's a concern. I think there are traditions and forms that are rich and are important and that you want to continue. And I think we all have anxieties. I do as a professor that's on the campus with a gospel choir. I think we all have anxieties when you see certain things not being continued. And I think your question is also rooted in the commercial and the business landscape. So also what happens to art forms when you can now go to PTL and you can go to TBN, so I also have to, I think we have to think about the fact that in 2021, we are like, 30 years deep into that being a reality. I mean, the reality is there was no space for a lot of these artists in the 50s and the 60s to go to. So as the church changes and as certain opportunities change, then I think the music does, it does evolve. And I understand your concerns.
Thank you. Let me try this on for a second. I mean, there's also a space where some of this, where it was always kind of marketed for mass audiences, and it's okay, I think, to kind of say that. So I think about, we think about Andrae Crouch as definitely being rooted in Black gospel, but he was in conversation in the 60s and 70s with the Jesus People movement. So white evangelicals who were like living on communes. And I never thought that much, but in the record of the album or the CD, whatever cover it was you were looking at for the tribute album Tapestry that was done to kind of model Carol Harold King's Tapestry tribute album. They had all of these people. And I took it as face value that if the Weiners are going to talk about their moment, when Wayne Watson does the same thing, it's like, okay, that's like, because everybody knows about tribute sort of within sort of Christian spaces, whether you're white or Black. Everybody knew the blood will never lose its power. Like there were just certain things that in fact were very, very transcendent in these communities. And you could go to a lot of different churches across a number of different denominations, and there would at least be some things that where there would be at least a common language there.
Yeah, I mean, he's a common language. Like, so my mom, we were talking about last night, there's a brilliant scholar, a guy who writes about Andrae Crouch. He has a podcast, and I hope I get his name right, Tim Dillinger. And he was talking about, the blood and this kind of the history of the blood and, Crouch and composition critic and James Cleveland, just a lot of interesting stuff. And Crouch wrote it as 14. But my mom was like, yeah, I first heard that with the Caravans in 65, as a little girl. She's 13. And I was like, oh, okay. So like that song, the introduction of that song for some people, and she's like, she was like, did Aretha Walker say, because as a kid, she went to the Caravan shows with her mother. And so when you think about the genealogy of that song, when she's introduced to that song, it's at, Mount Eric Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm introduced to that song through the blood. It's like it's in a non-denominational kind of space. And so it's completely different. And so, but yet that song has these like multiple points, when we have multiple points of entry.
Yeah. Thank you. Edgar Randolph asks, how has white patriarchy pushed back against gospel music? Could you speak to how Andrae Crouch experienced the pushback of the white patriarchy?
I'm not sure I understand, so white patriot, how did he experience like white racism or I know what white patriarchy is, but, and it's pushed back against gospel music.
Edgar, please feel free to write some clarifying remarks. I'll be happy to read those. And then I'll just move on to the next question. So the next two questions are about periodization. So LaShonda Brooks writes, I came in a little late, so I'm sorry if I missed this. How should we understand the connection of gospel and politics, particularly in the early 1990s with a political figure like Bill Clinton? How do we understand the use of gospel music in campaign trails or the singing of gospel in public? Is it just messaging or something more? And where does it lead us in the future of politics and gospel's intersections?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I think that's a great question. And as you phrase that question, the image of George Bush flanked by BB and CC Winans just immediately came to my mind. And their parents' reflection of that just being like a highlight moment in terms of their lives. I think the 1990s are a critical moment when we see the rise of neo-Pentecostalism. It is a critical moment when we think about tele-evangelism, and I'm thinking about the work of people like, Jonathan Walton. When you see really this conservative thrust, if you think about, the Weiners in 1985 are down with South Africa and, against, both the regime and Let My People Go, and are actually a part of a chorus that has very few Christian entertainers critiquing what's happening in South Africa. You fast forward 10 years and they're part of like the Promise Keepers. And so the 1990s is this interesting moment when there emerges a new thrust in terms of the cultural wars. And there are gospel artists who are very much a part of that. And some of those contemporary gospel artists, when we think about the 1990s, are a part of that. So for me, when I think about the 1990s and gospel and politics and periodization, I think of not so much George Clinton, but I think of Bush. And so I think of it as the beginning of, you think of Bush to say even 2004 and what happens in Ohio in terms of the election and questions around sexuality. So for me, it's like in the 1990s, I think of the Weiners, the two sisters, Debbie and Angie, the song "It's Not Natural." It really, that really, it gears up in the 90s. And where in the 70s and the 80s, there were these references and you heard the bring back the days of nay and yea, when we could plainly see the way when women were women and men were men. And you hear this in those Detroit artists that I talk about very much. But then by the 1990s, what I think you begin to see politically is you begin to see an alliance with certain parties. And I think in terms of periodization, that becomes important. At the same time, you have gospel artists like Shirley Caesar, who's not, who's actually pretty firmly rooted in the 90s in the Democratic Party. She's running, it's a little different. But I think when we think about periodization and we think about that moment, I think is extremely important. I think about in the late 1990s, there's this iconic picture of Kirk Franklin with Billy Graham. And it's a part of this moment of calling for interracial reconciliation. And to me, the 90s in terms of chronology is like a bridge that gets us from Andrae Crouch to a Lecrae, who once again, when he's talking about racial reconciliation, he's, for example, providing a critique of those who are critiquing, Black Lives Matter. So it's a different project. But I think the 90s are extremely important because I also think that there are some financial opportunities that open up in the 90s that are different. So it's really an important moment in terms of periodization. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. So Edgar's come back with the follow-up. Edgar is referencing Andrae Crouch's criminal history. Is that part of the pushback of white patriarchy?
His arrest in 1982?
I would assume so.
Yeah. That's a really interesting, complex episode. Andrae Crouch is arrested in 1982 by the LAPD. It's a turning point for his career. I think some people, I don't want to say it. Yeah, it's a turning point for his career, and I think some people would say it restructures his relationship to, I think, the contemporary Christian music scene. One of the things I will also argue is I think by 1982, some of that is already happening just as a result of this kind of relationship between Light Records and Warner Brothers. But yeah, I think it's an important moment. He vehemently denied that he had cocaine. The charges were dropped, and he credits it to racism. But to watch how this plays out in the white, kind of in the CCM, and I hate to keep saying like the white Christian magazine, but really they didn't really like Andrae Crouch and Larnell Harris and maybe a few other people, but he was one of the few African Americans that they covered. I think it does result in something, but at the same time, like when you talk about like the white patriarchy and Andrae Crouch and maybe thinking about, and I guess we would have to have a conversation about how we view that arrest. At the same time, he has this album where he talks about, he talks against abortion. He's pretty much a self-declared Republican. And so I think it's a complicated and a fraught relationship.
Thank you. Celeste Lee says, thoroughly enjoyed your explanation of why you stopped at the 90s. Can you offer insight about why you started at the 60s? Was it just a matter of the era being underexplored or something more?
No, that's a great question. I started in 60 and I started in 68 largely because of the formation of the Gospel Music Workshop of America. It was founded in 67, 68. The first convention was 68. Also, I didn't talk about this amazingly gifted family, the Hawkins. But Edwin Hawkins came out with Oh Happy Day in 1969, and it's a commercial smash. And in many ways, of course, Shirley Caesar also came out with Don't Throw Your Mama Away. But Oh Happy Day alters conventional ideas about the commercial possibilities of gospel. And so for me, 67, 68 is just a transformative time, and also Black music. I mean, to quote the great Sylvester Stewart, Sly Stone, people brought a whole new thing. And so when you think about 67, 68, 67, James Brown, Cold Sweat, the debut of Sly Stone's A Whole New Thing, Jimi Hendrix comes on the scene, Aretha Franklin's first album with, Atlantic Records, I've Never Loved a Man the Way That I Love You. But so 68 is very intentional, and it's very much it's very much Black power too. So it's very intentional for me. 68 is, the death of Dr. King. So that was very intentional in terms of 68. And I also wanted to move away from this notion that gospel was only important during the golden age. So I think there have been some amazing books on gospel golden age, the age of Mahalia Jackson and Clara Ward singers, and Sam Cooke and the classic quartets, the Dixie Hummingbirds, just so many people. And when you read things like Gospel Sound, so many foundational books in gospel studies, even Wyatt Tee Walker, Forrest Boyer, there's this Eileen Southern, so many people. There's this notion that the golden age of gospel was really in the 40s, from the 40s to the 60s. And it's kind of like in the 60s and the 70s, this new contemporary thing was working and is messing up the essence. And in that conversation about, the problem of this contemporary sound, and they would include, some people would include James Cleveland in that, is also, I think, a little bit of racial essentialism about what Black gospel should and should not sound like. But for me, 67 and 68, it was rooted in the release, and really from 68 to 72, whether you're talking about Crouch and Shirley Caesar, or my man Rance Allen. I think it was really rooted in these sonic interventions that were taking place and wanting to capture those, but also trying to write against this focus on the golden age.
Great, thanks. An anonymous attendee asks, can you touch on the role of Black religious media in the proliferation of gospel? Do you attribute any particular song in affecting or influencing a paradigm shift in the struggles of Black community?
Yeah. And did it say Black religious media or medium?
Black religious media.
Right. So that would be, yeah. So Black religious media is extremely important. And I think one of the most important developments in the 1980s, and interestingly enough, a lot of this comes out of Detroit, are the explosion of gospel magazines. And I think Teresa Harrison, for example, who was the founder of Gospel Today. I think it started out at SCORE. And I hope this is the question. It's so important to the explosion of gospel and also the writing of gospel. And I really couldn't do what I did without those Black gospel magazines, even also Totally Gospel, which came out of Detroit and started in the 80s. I think also, how can we forget, I'll Be Right, We'll Be Back, Bobby Jones, the Bobby Jones Gospel Show, which debuts on BET. So there is no conversation about the explosion of gospel, in the 80s without thinking about, Bobby Jones, and the fact that you could, 9 in the morning, and 9 at night, you could watch Bobby Jones and you could see, hopefully, some of your favorite gospel singers. I must admit, I always thought he was light on contemporary gospel, so I feel like my mom saw more of her favorite people than I did. But I think when we think about the explosion of gospel, Black religious radio, Black religious, Black magazines, and also television is important. And that's the important thing. I mean, we've had these conversations about kind of like these, these interracial alliances, but gospel music at the same time, Black gospel music was largely in art form supported by Black people and Black institutions. I would also add, it's not religious, but the Black press. And this is just a methodological question. I could have never done this work without the Norfolk Journal and Guide and the Pittsburgh Courier and Ebony Magazine. These were mediums that also had big stories on gospel artists. And that was hard to find, because also there was a tendency of the critical establishment. You were not going to find write-ups on Andrae Crouch in the Rolling Stone, or, there were some writers in the New York Times and the Washington Post would pay attention to people like Andrae Crouch and James Cleveland and Shirley Caesar. There was always a select few, but the Black press is essential. Black press is crucial. And also Black record stores. And in fact, that is something that's extremely important for me as I think about the fragility of the Black Gospel Archive. And in doing this research, I relied a lot on Black record stores in places like Barkey's in Richmond and God's World in Detroit and Reeves in Northern California, which at the time of its closing was the oldest Black-owned record store in the nation. And so Black media was extremely important. I think if I had to pick one particular song, it's hard for me to pick one gospel song. Also because I think gospel music has so many varied meanings. There's something very powerful. So I think Peace Be Still, which is the focus of a new book by Robert Maravich, which is just brilliant. But Peace Be Still came out in November of 1963, but it was recorded only 4 days after the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. And there's nothing explicitly political about that song. And according to Robert Maravich, who once again, this book, Peace Be Still, his book is amazing. The people who were involved in the making of that song, they say that wasn't something that was necessarily on their minds when they recorded, but he talks about later what that song is. You can imagine what it meant. 1963, that's the year of Medgar's assassination. That's the year of, the bombing in Birmingham, King's I Have a Dream, late assassination of JFK, of Kennedy, Malcolm leaving the Nation of Islam. And I know it's so much more that I'm missing. When you think in 1963, what it must have felt like to hear, peace be still, the winds and the waves will obey. It had to be powerful. And at the same time, if you've ever seen Eyes on the Prize and that segment when Carl Stokes is running for mayor in Cleveland, there's a choir and they're singing Peace Be Still, and it hits. And so to me, that is definitely a transformational song that doesn't have it's funny, when I'm going through certain things and I need a little boost, and I love Let My People Go by the Weiners, and but sometimes I need to hear James Cleveland, Lord, help me to hold out, And sometimes it's not necessarily that I even believe fully in what he's saying theologically, but I believe in the people who believe. Yeah.
Thank you for that response. So we are kind of coming towards the end of our time. There are lots of questions, shout outs from former students who say hello, lots of gratitude being expressed here. So I do want to convey that collectively and engagement with the talk in your responses. This may be the last question, but I'm not quite sure. I saved this one for the last. Jacqueline Reese asks, where can we find additional talks from you?
I was going to say hopefully nowhere. I think there may be some. There is a talk. There's a talk with and this is tough, but there is a talk on the University of Illinois where you can find the book with me, Corey Walker, who's just brilliant friend, and my dear friend, my late friend, Greg Tate. So it's me, Corey Walker, and Greg Tate. Greg Tate passed away on December 7th, 2021. And his impact and his influence just on me and everything, I was just real blessed to meet him at an important time. And we became good friends. And yet every time he would call, I would look at my phone and I'd be like, that's great tape. But anyway, I love that. I love that conversation that we have. And while my computer, something was going on with my computer, and unfortunately it's me talking on a phone, and you all know how that looks. But I think that's a good space to hear three people who are very passionate about just, culture and politics and religion. So yeah, that's on the, I think that's on the website of University of Illinois Press, but I think it's on YouTube as well. So if you just put in Claudrena Harold and Corey Walker and Greg Tate, you can find it. But that's important to me. And I'm also, I think, chopping it up with Mark Anthony Neal on Left of Black. But yeah, so.
Great, thank you. So again, the accolades and the gratitude continue to pour in.
Thank you all.
So I know you can't see us, but thank you so much for this talk. It has been wonderful. I'm going to share my screen real quick.
And let me just say thank you really quick. You heard me talk about Andrae Crouch, and your encouragement and your affirmation was so important because I was very nervous about doing this gospel thing. For one, it's important to me on a personal level, and not in some kind of really theological, spiritual way, but I think as someone who had never done music, you don't necessarily want to share something that's personal and that you love with the rest of the world because you don't want them sometimes to even interrogate. And so you came in a critical moment when I was still trying to figure it out as a scholarly subject. So thank you a lot.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure. I'm just so glad that you've gotten a chance to present it. And I'm so sad that you didn't get to present it in person, physically in Jones Library. So thank you again. I think, just from the feedback that I'm getting here, it seems like everybody has been really excited sort of about what you've presented today. And I hope that you take that as affirmation of the really important work that you do. Before I let everybody go today, I do want to remind folks again of our Black Asian Solidarity public dialogue that'll be this Thursday at 6 p.m. So we hope that you'll sign up and join us for that. And then we hope that you come back next week. So again, we're going to have another great talk next week. Next week's speaker is going to be Niambi Carter from Howard University, who's going to talk about Back to Africa movements and Black immigration. So with that, thank you so much for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Take care.